Thank you very much, Father Benji, and I'll ask our technician to allow me to share the screen.
Yes, Father, it's allowed.
Okay, thank you. There we are. Okay. I hope you can see the screen. Okay, as Father Benji has already mentioned and others have a few points. One will be what is the mission of accompaniment as seen in these documents. Then I say a few things about Evangelii Gaudium. And then I will also say a few more things about Fratelli Tutti, which are related to our way of proceeding. And then we have some concluding remarks. Okay. Now, what is the mission of accompaniment? I think it is a big question, and it touches all of us as chaplains, animators, and people who help others to get into the life of Christ. And I start with this quotation from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 15. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. I think this mission by itself is important. It is meant for all of us, actually, who are followers of Christ. And I think is a mission to humanize, is a mission to divinize. That's what I call accompaniment in the extreme sense of the word. And this is reminiscing on the wisdom of St. Irenaeus, who say the glory of God is man fully alive, but the life of man is the vision of God. So it's a connection of humanity and divinity. And this is what accompaniment is all about, that which goes naturally with the other. So humanity should go naturally with God, and God should go naturally with humanity. Now, this is a few points from Evangelii Gaudium, and this is the papal document as you see it. In some places, they have the joy of the gospel, as you say. Some of you may have read it already, some of you may have seen it, some of what my head being talked about. So I took actually some of the details on spiritual accompaniment, on accompaniment, is the Evangelii Gaudium. The numbers 169 to 173 talks a lot about what accompaniment is all about from the point of view of Pope Francis. Maybe I'll read this quotation, which is 173. I just take one of them and just make a few comments about it. It says, genuine spiritual accompaniment always begins and flourishes in the context of service to the mission of evangelization. This is St. Paul, relationship with Timothy and Titus provides an example of this accompaniment and formation which takes place in the midst of apostolic activity, entrusting them with the mission of remaining in each city to put in order what remains to be done. So actually they were to carry on the work of St. Paul, which he didn't finish. Paul also gives them rules for their personal lives and their pastoral activity. This is clearly distinct from every kind of intrusive accompaniment or isolated self-realization. Missionary disciples accompany missionary disciples. So you see, what Paul did is what Timothy and Titus will do. So that's one And then almost to look at the purpose, the dream of is transformation. And this again is from Evangelii Gaudium. You see what he says, number 27. I dream of a missionary option, that is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world rather than for her self-preservation. So the dream is out there, and the Pope has clearly said what it is. And we see the impulse is to transform, is to harmonize, I would say, to divinize and humanize the whole of creation. Now, there are a few other things which are actually very interesting for us as IMCS, as chaplains and so on. And I took this quotation again from Evangelii Gaudium, number 48. And it says, if the whole church takes up this missionary impulse, she has to go forth to everyone without exception. But to whom should she go first? When we read the gospel, we find a clear indication, not so much our friends and wealthy neighbors, but above all, the poor and the sick, those who are usually despised and overlooked, those who cannot repay you. That's a direct quotation from Luke chapter 14, verse 14. There can be no room for doubt or for explanations which weaken so clear a message. Today and always, the poor are the privileged recipients of the gospel. So the message cannot be clearer why we do what we do. Moreover, talk a bit about solidarity, the common good, peace, and justice. The word solidarity is a little worn and at times poorly understood, but it refers to something more than a few sporadic acts of generosity. It presumes the creation of a new mindset which thinks in terms of community and the priority of the life of all over the appropriation of goods by a few. The private ownership of goods is justified by the need to protect and to increase them so that they can better serve the common good. For this reason, solidarity must be lived as a decision to restore the poor what belongs to them. Sometimes it is a matter of hearing the cry of the entire peoples, the poorest peoples of the earth, since peace is found not only on respect for human rights, but also on respect for the rights of peoples. These words are loaded, and there's a lot we can say about them, but we won't have time to go to all the details, but it's good to really have a taste of Evangelii Gaudium to get the joy of it. It also invites us to those who, wounded by historical divisions, find it difficult to accept our invitation to forgiveness and reconciliation, since they think that we are ignoring their pain and asking them to give up their memory and ideals. But if they see the witness of authentically fraternal and reconciled communities, they will find that witness luminous and attractive. So we are called to go beyond words to be people of action. So we go for integral development. This is a continuation of the same, actually. In the end, a peace which is not a result of integral development will be doomed. It will always spawn new conflicts and various forms of violence. People in every nation enhance the social dimension of their lives by acting as committed and responsible citizens, not as a mob swayed by the powers that be. It is an ongoing process in which every new generation must take part, a slow and arduous effort calling for a desire for integration and a willingness to achieve this through the growth of a peaceful and multifaceted culture of encounter. Moreover, it has to be in dialogue with the people, and not only one people, not only a few people, but a people as a whole. In a culture which privileges dialogue as a form of encounter, it is time to devise a means for building consensus and agreement while seeking the goal of a just, responsive, and inclusive society. The principal author, the historic subject of this process, is the people as a whole, the people as a whole, and their culture, and not a single class, minority, a group, or the elite. We do not need plans drawn up by a few for the few, or an enlightened or outspoken minority which claims to speak for everyone. It is about agreeing to live together, a social and a cultural pact. It's again a direct quotation from Evangelii Gaudium 239. Now, there is a lot that should give us joy from Evangelii Gaudium, but then we are to say something also about Fratelli Tutti. And these are a few quotations and remarks from Fratelli Tutti. First of all, let's look at Fratelli Tutti. First of all, it is an amazing synthesis of the social teachings of Pope Francis over his first 7.5 years, almost 8 years, of his pontificate. Unlike other encyclicals that refer quite frequently to saints, previous popes, previous encyclicals and biblical texts, this one draws references from his own various addresses, homilies, international meetings, writings, discourses, and more specifically from the book. I think Father Giorgio will say something more about it, Laudato Si. There are in this Fratelli Tutti 287 paragraphs in 8 chapters with 288 footnotes. In Fratelli Tutti, one can find ideas that could help one to enter into a serious study, into serious prayer, into serious reflection for days, weeks, months, even years. Is a treasure, is a beautiful book. Some of you may have seen, I don't know, there's front pages of the book covers of many, but this is the one that I like best. The encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti on fraternity and social friendship by Pope Francis. And as you can see, what this whatever publisher used the image of the Good Samaritan to express his sentiments, as it were, and it really catches what it means to be in Fratelli Tutti on fraternity and social friendship. This is what social friendship is all about: is action rather than words, as it were. The inspiration, where did the Pope get the inspiration from? I would say something about it. Pope Francis acknowledges the inspiration he draws from his meeting with the Grand Imam, Ahmad Al-Tayeb, in 2019, in their joint document on human fraternity for peace. Besides, he refers to many statements of episcopal conferences from all over the world. I suppose this gives not only recognition to the discernment of the episcopal conferences, but also actualizes his invitation to what we are talking these days, synodality, the working together. This is a form of accompaniment, I think, and that's a great inspiration which still continues Now, his approach, thirdly, his framework is Christian, but his approach is very clearly ecumenical and interfaith, calling for dialogue with complete openness to truth and love. He does not claim to offer a complete teaching, but only opens the door for genuine dialogue with everyone. His approach must be in what we know very well. I think in our movement, we have seen it often. It has been used explicitly and sometimes implicitly, is the see, judge, and act, which we know. However, it might probably be better to speak of see as discern. This is a word which Pope Francis likes much, and commit rather than see, judge, and act. Seeing must be done by an application of the five senses. Okay, we know our five senses anyway. There's no need to explain. And discerning, and not simply judging with our mental faculty. And thirdly, committing, and not simply doing things or having many activities and programs. This commitment must emerge through a collective discernment. And Fratelli Tutti presents this approach quite clearly. We'll talk about that a little later as we go through this document. Now, I'd like to look at Fratelli Tutti. I think just to give you a kind of an overview, so as to be able to understand it in its context, as it were. Now, the first chapter of Fratelli Tutti, for example, is entitled "Took Me to the Dark Clouds of a Closed World." Now, for some of us, you see, it's a question of seeing, dark clouds of a closed world. And this, for us, reminds most of us, especially those of us who have been in the Society of Jesus and the Ignatian spirituality, the meditation of the Incarnation, where the Trinity looks down on the earth. Now, I don't know, the Trinity may still be there and is still looking down on the earth. What do they see? They see what is going on. It is not merely seeing, but clearly applying the five senses of seeing, of hearing, of touching, of smelling, and observing. In fact, the first chapter sets the scenario for Fratelli Tutti. It identifies the lights and shadows, the challenges and opportunities. It presents the reality as Pope Francis, the Vicar of Christ, sees it today. He sees the world as a fragmented, shattered one without any shared roadmap. As people talk these days on planning and so forth, they talk about roadmaps if you're planning, with no human dignity and respect for one another, especially respect for the poor. If you are poor, you go to an office, they may not even look at you, they continue their business. This is a poor man, okay, fine. If they look at you, it's because they respect you, but it's not always the case. At the same time, the world with an abundance of resources. I mean, we have a lot of resources, oceans, minerals, scientific, technological knowledge, and human wisdom that can solve problems and give new hope. Love and aspiration. Many of our young people, they have a lot of love, they have a lot of aspiration, they have a lot from the works of solidarity done by people during the time of COVID-19. I think we see a lot of good work being done during this time. And perhaps in your area, in your corner, you've seen what people have done, especially for the people who are old and cannot move, and people have done a lot of good things. There's a lot of goodwill that is also in the world. So that's what the first chapter really sees, huh? As it were. Sets the context for Fratelli Tutti. Now there is a theological, then we go to the second chapter actually. And I think many people would agree that this second chapter sets what you call the theological foundation for Fratelli Tutti. And this is so well the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's why I mentioned that I like the publisher who published his book with that cover of the story of the Good Samaritan. Becomes the theological foundation and defining moment for the encyclical, talking about accompaniment of the wounded. This is a really theologically, you can talk about the Good Samaritan. We can have a whole day of talking about the Good Samaritan and the theology of it, but more or less, you know, the Good Samaritan is part of the Fratelli Tutti, and chapter 2 seems to be the beginning of the whole. Now we go on to chapter 3, 4, and 5. Can be like the second and third weeks of the exercises. When Jesus lives the message he preaches. These chapters speak of creating an open world, a world that is not closed, not exclusive, not centered on oneself, but a world that is inclusive, based on the universal love, on compassion, equality, and solidarity. It is not limited to having a world that is open for everyone, but a heart that must be open. This is clearly articulated in chapter 4, entitled, A Heart Open to the Whole World. He advocates the moral and ethical principles of love, justice, desire, to learn and appreciate one another, for establishing good relationships with one another. Like Jesus, who commented strongly on unjust rulers, Pharisees and Sadducees. Fratelli Tutti also critiques the present-day political and economic structures and the styles of leadership. Then we move on to see a little bit of chapter 6, 7, and 8 as an invitation to everyone to experience the resurrection and renew oneself and the human society at large. Fratelli Tutti speaks about a society that is first, a society that dialogues with one another, irrespective of their origin, birth, nationality, race, color, etc. Second, builds bridges. We're talking about a society will reach even with those who do not agree with us. 3, it creates a new culture based on truth, forgiveness, love, and peace. And chapter 8 at the end mandates everyone, like the contemplation, to obtain love in the spiritual exercises, to go and live it to the full. Fratelli Tutti appeals that religions must be at the service of humanity in the world, and he makes a prayer to the Creator for that new world. We continue. At the start of chapter 1, Pope Francis speaks about shattered dreams in points 10 to 12. And in the last chapter, he speaks about the collective dream for a better world. So the encyclical moves from a shattered dream to a collective dream for building a new heaven and a new earth, a world that is not individual-centered, where all are equal pilgrims and fellow travelers. So I'm coming almost to the end, but to make it clear for people to understand, like these few concluding remarks. Fratelli Tutti is a social encyclical. It reminds us of a new kind of teaching that started in 1891. Maybe it's not so new for us, it's been there for a few centuries, with Pope Leo XIII, a document which is very dear to Pax Romana, to IMCS, in Rerum Novarum. It puts the social question at the center and calls the faithful to engage in the field, even in contrast to other movements. However, it is not only a social cyclical, it is a deeply spiritual, as one looks at it from different angles. And I'll repeat what I said already. Let us look at it from the three perspectives. We have looked at from three perspectives: from see, judge, and act, from the spiritual exercises, and from the point of view of reconciliation. I said at the beginning that this is also the see, judge, and act method. We talked about discernment and commitment, and so I put it this way. As you see, this is C, chapter 1, the dark clouds over the closed world, which I'm putting all the chapters as they are in his book, and you see this one. And then you see the discernment. The discernment, it has several chapters, actually. It has almost 6 chapters. A stranger on the road, and I put it in bold there, because this is the story of the Good Samaritan, which starts with chapter 2. He has a long comment and theological reflections on it. And then we have this envisaging and engendering an open world, which we talked about it. This is chapter 3. Then chapter 4, a heart open to the whole world. And then chapter 5, a better kind of politics. Okay, some people say the church shouldn't talk of politics, but we are part of the world. We're part of the politics of the world as well. So chapter 6, the dialogue and friendship in society. These are the big points, the values that we really need to insist. And then new paths for renewed encounter. And then chapter 8, how to commit. That all the religions of the world at the worldwide service of fraternity. So this is what I would say. If we use our method as people, members of IMCS, to see, to judge, and to act, then we can see it from this perspective. This is how we can see this document. And then we go on to how do we look at it from the point of view of the spiritual exercises. This is one way of looking at it. If you want to read it and to understand it from the point of view of spirituality, we use what we call, some of you may have heard of Spiritual Exercises. Is the book that was written by St. Ignatius of Loyola, and is kind of partitioned into four weeks. I have this sentence here. It says, we are trying to do something that perhaps the Pope himself, Francis, wouldn't do. There's a sense of humor here. As putting incongruent things together. Humor is as putting congruent. So it's a humorous way of doing these things. Like you say, the church is full of sinners and saints. So we are putting two things together, which sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't. But we're trying to put this in concurrent things, the Fratelli Tutti, as well as the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius together. So I started at the beginning and explained that meditation of the incarnation. And you see the dark clouds of a closed world. And then the conclusions of the first week, the Good Samaritan, the Theological Foundation there. Then we have the life and the teaching of Jesus, second week. So you have envisaging and engendering the world, chapter 3, 4, and 5. And then the discipleship, the heart open to the whole world, and a better kind of politics, go to chapter 5. And then we have at the end the resurrection and the mission, which we have in the fourth week of the spiritual exercise of St. Ignatius. And then you have all this dialogue and friendship, you have path for renewed encounter, and then you have religions at the service of fraternity in our world. So this would be another way of looking at Fratelli Tutti. And I think it helps us to accompany those who we deal with to understand the depth of these two books. Finally, I have an understanding that Pope Francis has a series of things in his mind, and they are really interconnected. He's not talking of the air, he has a connection. We have Evangelii Gaudium, which we spoke about it for a few minutes. Then we have in between, I talked about Laudato Si, and then we have Fratelli Tutti, which is a series of his writings. And if we are to combine them and to understand them well, his idea of is of comprehensive reconciliation. That is, the first one, as we start with Evangelii Gaudium, he speaks, if we are to talk about it clearly, he speaks about reconciliation with God, reconciliation with the Creator. So that is first one. Of course, you remember it was written already on the 24th of November, 2013. And then 2 years later, he writes this And then finally, he talks about reconciliation, Fratelli Tutti, which was written 5 years later. Fratelli Tutti, or Fratelli Tutti is not only brothers, but sisters. This is humanity. This is the title that he uses from St. Francis. 5 years later, he writes this book and his reconciliation with human beings. So from the point of view of us who have been close to this situation, is you connect with heaven, you connect with the created humanity and so forth, and you create the whole of creation. So it's about reconciliation. I call it comprehensive reconciliation in that sense. And then finally, some people may have questions. I have my questions as well. And I like to mention this quotation here before we end. Is fraternity a social utopia, what you call it? If it is, then it is practical in a complex world. Is it practical in a complex world like ours? Can we really talk about fraternity? Can we really love everybody? Can we really reconcile with everybody? Now, one of the best comments I've seen is from this French sociologist, Edgar Morin. He has very encouraging words. I think it's good to know about it. His comment on the fraternity cells. Fragile like conscience. I think all of us understand what conscience is, and it's fragile. Fragile like love. We talk about love, whose strength is nevertheless unheard of. But they have a lot of, and yet a means of resisting the cruelty of the world. So I think this is a very human way of looking at this document. And if we are accompanying people, actually, we're accompanying people, we're trying to touch their conscience, we're trying to evoke their vibes, their love, which is the actual strength. Although on the other side, it could be very, very fragile. Finally, I talk about comprehensive reconciliation. So you see, this picture is taken in one of the churches in Italy, and this is as if this is heaven and this is the world, and the rest is, the whole idea is to reconcile the world and the heavens. So I will like to leave there. I think I have done my 30 minutes or whatever. So we'll back to Benji. And if there are any questions, please do not feel free, or even your own experiences you're sharing that you like to share on these documents, and especially on accompaniment, you are most welcome. So thank you, and back to you.